On the night she was sold to a lonely cowboy rancher, everyone in town expected screams to echo from the farmhouse before dawn, but what happened behind that closed bedroom door became the secret that changed both their lives forever. If you love emotional cowboy romance stories filled with heartbreak, redemption, shocking twists, and powerful love stories that stay with you long after the ending, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this story will break your heart before it heals it. The rain fell hard across the Wyoming plains the night Clara Whitmore arrived at Caleb Boone's ranch in the back of a rusted wagon, her wrists aching from holding herself together for 3 straight days. She was 20 years old, exhausted, hungry, and carrying the kind of fear that hollowed a person from the inside. The old preacher who rode beside her wouldn't look her in the eye. Neither would the man driving the wagon. In the town she had just left behind, people whispered that Caleb Boone was cold as winter iron, a cowboy who lived too far from civilization and spoke too little for any woman to feel safe near him. They said he bought her debt from the man who owned the boarding house after her father died drunk and penniless. Some said Caleb only wanted a woman to cook and clean. Others said worse things in hushed voices outside saloons. Clara sat silently through all of it, gripping the edge of her thin coat while the wagon wheels rattled through mud toward the ranch where she believed her freedom would end. Every mile made her stomach twist tighter. She had heard stories about men who bought desperate women. None of those stories ended kindly. When the ranch finally appeared through sheets of rain, Clara's heartbeat turned shallow. A lonely farmhouse stood against the dark hills with one lantern glowing near the porch. Horses stirred inside the stable nearby. The place looked quiet, almost painfully quiet, and that somehow frightened her more than shouting would have. The wagon stopped. Caleb Boone stepped out from the shadows wearing a black hat dripping with rainwater and a thick brown coat brought across the shoulders. He looked older than she expected, maybe 35, hardened by years beneath the sun. His face carried old scars near his jawline, and his eyes held the distant look of a man who trusted almost nothing. Clara lowered her gaze immediately. She expected him to inspect her like property. Instead, he handed the driver a folded paper, signed something quickly, and then looked at Clara only once before speaking. "You should come inside before you freeze." His voice surprised her. Deep, calm, tired. Not cruel. Just tired. Clara climbed down slowly from the wagon, every muscle tense. She waited for his hand to grab her arm, but it never came. He simply picked up her tiny suitcase and walked toward the porch while she followed several steps behind. Inside, warmth wrapped around her instantly from the fireplace crackling in the corner. The farmhouse smelled like cedarwood and coffee. A pot of stew sat near the stove. Caleb placed her suitcase beside the staircase. "There's food if you're hungry," he said. Clara stared at him cautiously. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. The question lingered in the room longer than either of them expected. Caleb removed his hat slowly and hung it near the door. Rainwater dripped from the brim onto the floorboards. "Tonight," he answered. "Nothing." Clara blinked in confusion. He pointed toward the staircase. "Second room on the left is yours." Her throat tightened. "Mine." He nodded once. "You lock the door if it helps you sleep." Clara felt her heartbeat stumble. Men like him were not supposed to say things like that. She waited for the real demand to come, but it never did. Caleb walked to the stove and filled a bowl with stew while she remained frozen near the stairs. "You can eat before bed," he said. "Or not. Doesn't matter." Then he sat at the table alone, giving her space as though she were a frightened animal he didn't want to corner. Clara slowly climbed the stairs, still unable to believe what she'd heard. Inside the small bedroom she found clean blankets folded neatly across the bed and a candle already lit beside the window. She locked the door immediately, then sat on the edge of the mattress listening for footsteps. None came. Hours passed before exhaustion finally dragged her into sleep. But even then she slept lightly, expecting the sound of the lock turning at any moment. It never did. The next morning Clara woke to sunlight pouring across the floorboards and the smell of bacon drifting upstairs. For a brief moment she forgot where she was. Then memory crashed back. She sat upright instantly. The door remained locked exactly as she left it. Her stomach twisted with cautious confusion. Downstairs Caleb stood near the stove cooking breakfast. He glanced toward her briefly when she entered but returned to the pan without speaking. "Coffee's there," he said. Clara sat carefully at the table. "Why did you buy my debt?" she finally asked. Caleb remained silent for several seconds. Because your father owed dangerous men, he answered. And because they planned to send you someplace worse. Clara looked down at her hands. So now I owe you. Caleb placed a plate in front of her. No, he said firmly. You work here if you choose. That's different. She stared at him uncertainly. And if I don't choose? He met her eyes then, steady and unreadable. Then when winter breaks and roads clear, I'll take you wherever you want to go. Clara did not know what to do with kindness that came without demand. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. Cruelty at least made sense. Over the following weeks Clara slowly settled into life at the ranch, though fear still shadowed her movements. Caleb remained distant but respectful. He never entered her room without permission. Never touched her unexpectedly. Never drank heavily like the men she'd known growing up. Most nights he sat on the porch alone after dinner staring across the fields with whiskey untouched beside him. Clara began noticing small things about him. The way he repaired broken fence posts before sunrise. The way horses calmed instantly around him. The way he quietly left extra firewood outside her room whenever nights turned cold. Yet the ranch itself carried sadness beneath its silence. One evening Clara discovered why. She found a small grave behind the barn marked with faded flowers and a wooden cross. Sarah Boone, beloved wife. Clara froze. Caleb's wife had died 3 years earlier during childbirth, according to old Mrs. Parker from town. The baby died too. After that Caleb became a ghost among men. He stopped attending dances, stopped laughing, stopped living beyond work. That night Clara watched him differently during supper. She saw grief hiding behind his silence. Not cruelty. Just grief so deep it had hardened into loneliness. And loneliness recognized loneliness. Slowly conversations between them grew longer. He taught her how to ride across the northern fields. She taught him how to make proper peach pie instead of the terrible burnt biscuits he survived on alone. Winter storms trapped them indoors for days sometimes, and during those long evenings Clara found herself laughing unexpectedly beside the fireplace while Caleb told quiet stories about reckless cattle drives from his youth. Each laugh seemed to surprise him too, as though he had forgotten he was capable of causing one. But fear still lived inside Clara. One night everything changed. A storm rattled the windows violently while thunder rolled over the plains. Clara woke trembling from a nightmare about the boarding house owner who once tried forcing himself into her room. She couldn't breathe. Before realizing what she was doing, she hurried downstairs shaking uncontrollably. Caleb looked up instantly from the chair near the fireplace where he had been reading. Clara. She wrapped her arms around herself. I'm sorry, she whispered. Her voice broke. Caleb stood slowly but kept distance between them. Bad dream. She nodded, tears burning her eyes with humiliation. He placed another log onto the fire. Sit, he said gently. Clara sat near the warmth trying to steady her breathing. Silence settled between them comfortably until she finally whispered the question that had haunted her since arriving. Why haven't you touched me? Caleb stared into the flames for a long moment. Because fear ain't love, he answered quietly. Clara felt tears sting unexpectedly. No man had ever spoken to her that way before. Caleb finally looked at her then. Nobody should have their first night stolen from them, he said. Not by debt. Not by hunger. Not by fear. His jaw tightened slightly as though the words carried personal pain. If you ever choose somebody, Clara, it should be because your heart feels safe enough to want it. Something inside her cracked open then. Not from romance. From relief. From finally being seen as human. She cried silently beside the fire while Caleb pretended not to notice, giving her dignity even in pain. Spring arrived slowly across the plains, bringing wildflowers and softer air. By then Clara no longer flinched whenever Caleb entered a room. She trusted the sound of his footsteps. Trusted the steadiness in his voice. Trusted the strange gentleness beneath his rough exterior. And somewhere during those months Caleb began changing too. Townspeople noticed first. He smiled occasionally now. He attended church again. He even repaired the old swing outside the house because Clara once mentioned loving swings as a child. But happiness rarely arrives without testing itself first. Trouble rode into town one afternoon in the form of Victor Hale, the wealthy landowner who once controlled Clara's father through gambling debt. Victor was handsome in the polished way snakes are beautiful. Dangerous beneath charm. Clara's blood turned cold when she saw him step into the general store. He smiled immediately upon spotting her. Well now, he said smoothly. There's my missing girl. Caleb appeared beside Clara before she could answer. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. Boone. Caleb's voice remained calm. Hale. The tension between them tightened instantly. Victor glanced toward Clara with cruel amusement. I came to collect what belongs to me. Caleb stepped slightly closer to Clara. She ain't property. Victor smirked. Everything's property to someone. Clara saw Caleb's jaw flex dangerously. For one terrible moment she thought violence would explode right there. Instead Caleb spoke quietly. You should leave town. Victor's smile vanished completely then. Careful, Cowboy, he said softly. You don't know everything about the girl you brought home. That night Clara finally confessed the truth. Years earlier, desperate for money after her mother died, her father borrowed heavily from Victor Hale. When debts grew impossible, Victor began expecting Clara herself as payment. Caleb listened silently while rage darkened his expression more with every word. I ran before he could take me, Clara whispered shakily. That boarding house owner worked for him. Caleb stood abruptly and walked outside into darkness. Clara feared she had broken whatever fragile peace existed between them. But several minutes later he returned carrying her old suitcase. He placed it gently beside her chair. Pack what matters most, he said. Her heart dropped. You want me gone? Caleb looked almost offended by the question. No, he answered firmly. I'm taking you somewhere safer until I deal with Hale. Clara stared at him in disbelief. You'd fight him for me. Caleb knelt in front of her then, eyes steady. Clara, he said quietly, nobody owns you. Tears filled her eyes instantly. In that moment she realized something terrifying. She loved him, not because he rescued her. Because he gave her back pieces of herself she thought were lost forever. The confrontation came 3 days later near the northern pasture. Victor Hale arrived with hired men carrying rifles and legal papers claiming ownership over Caleb's ranch through unpaid old debts. The documents were fraudulent, but powerful men often made truth bend around money. Clara watched from the porch trembling as tensions escalated beneath darkening skies. Caleb stood alone facing them while wind whipped across the fields. Victor dismounted slowly. Last chance, he called out. Hand over the girl and sign the land. Caleb's answer came cold and sharp. No. Guns shifted instantly. Clara's heartbeat thundered painfully. Then suddenly voices echoed from behind the hills. Riders appeared across the ridge, neighbors, ranchers, townsmen. Nearly 20 of them. Old Mrs. Parker's sons. The blacksmith. Even the preacher. Men Caleb once helped during blizzards and droughts. Men who knew exactly what Victor Hale truly was. They rode forward silently until Victor realized he was outnumbered. Caleb never moved his eyes from him. Leave, he said. Victor glared at Clara one final time with hatred burning openly now. This ain't finished. Caleb stepped closer. It is. Victor eventually rode away with his men disappearing into the dust. Clara nearly collapsed from relief. Later that night after the ranch quieted again, she found Caleb alone near the barn tending a horse. Moonlight silvered the fields around them. You could have lost everything today, she whispered. Caleb shrugged lightly. Some things matter more. Clara stepped closer slowly, heart pounding harder with every breath. Why? She asked. Caleb looked at her carefully. Because somewhere along the way, he admitted softly, you stopped feeling like someone I rescued. His voice lowered almost painfully. And started feeling like home. Clara's chest ached. She reached for his hand trembling slightly. Caleb looked startled by the contact, as though still afraid to believe he deserved tenderness after so many lonely years. You once told me nobody should have their first night stolen in fear, Clara whispered. I never forgot. Caleb swallowed hard. Clara, she stepped closer until only inches remained between them. You gave me a choice, she said. Nobody ever did before. Tears burned her eyes again, but this time they came from something gentler. So now I'm choosing. Caleb touched her cheek carefully like a man handling something breakable. You don't owe me love. Clara smiled shakily. Good, she whispered. Because this isn't debt. Then she kissed him beneath the Wyoming moon while wind moved softly through the grass around them. The kiss carried no possession, no fear, no demand. Only two wounded people finding safety in each other after years of loneliness. And when Caleb finally wrapped his arms around her, he held her like something precious rather than owned. Later that night Clara stood outside her bedroom door upstairs, heart racing with nervous excitement. Caleb remained downstairs near the fireplace, giving her space even now. She walked slowly back toward the staircase until he looked up. "You, all right?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded once. Then after a long breath she extended her hand toward him. "Stay with me tonight," she whispered. Caleb stared at her silently, emotion breaking across his guarded face. "You sure?" Clara smiled through tears. "Yes." He climbed the stairs slowly beside her, still giving her every chance to change her mind. Inside her room he paused near the door uncertainly. Clara stepped forward first, resting her forehead gently against his chest. For the first time in her life, fear did not follow desire. Safety did. Caleb kissed her softly, reverently, like a promise instead of a claim. Outside, rain began falling lightly across the plains again, but inside that small farmhouse something broken in both of them finally began to heal. And years later, whenever people in town told the story of Caleb Boone and the girl who arrived terrified at his ranch one stormy night, they always remembered the same thing most of all. Not that he bought her debt, not the fight with Victor Hale, not even the love that followed. They remembered that when the world tried taking her first night through fear, the cowboy gave it back as a choice.